All right, Yosef, we're here. Say
All
hi.
right. Hi. Hello, format.
Okay, so I want to introduce everyone to Yoseph Needelman, author of Cannabis, Chassidis. Before we get into the questions for the interview, do you want to sort of introduce yourself, what you've done in the psychedelic Jewish arena over the years, where you're from, stuff like that?
Sure. Well, which is a challenge because I think part of what I feel close to is the things that are hard to describe from what we've been doing because we've been keeping a secret. The whole interplay between the mystical tradition and the entheogenic tradition is the stuff that you get in trouble for talking about, and that a lot of the culture is built around not talking except in person about in context. I wrote a book called Cannabis, Chassidis, detailing a lot of personal research. And I feel weird using the word research because I very self-consciously didn't want to treat it as an objective or like study. It was an immersion. It was like not just going native, but I think the goal was start from native and
Memoir
from native
style.
try to start from I didn't, my conceit wasn't outside as a historiographer or as a to prove a point as much as sort of testify an observed tradition and experienced tradition that I felt I had grown up into from initially from just the mix of priorities growing up in religious educated context and appreciating weed as a street thing, as a New York City sort of like
Can you
street
give the
phenomenon.
premise of Cannabis, Chassidis and kind of like the elevator pitch is like what are the main idea, like what is Chassidus that is inspired by cannabis and psychedelics?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And part of the challenge of describing it is how much it sort of evolves in the book. There is a sense that um, Judaism had to change and grow. And part of what it did to do that was hide its own mystical nature for a different time, which becomes re-explored regularly historically in movements called Chassidus in different time periods. Like the Hasidei Ashkenaz is sort of mystical, ecstatic movement from the medieval period. It's much more dour. It's much more sort of fasting based than entheogenic based, although it's a mystery what triggers ascetic responses sometimes, especially semi-psychotic ones, I think, which is the main problem with that particular movement. People got into fasting themselves to death, and most of what Kabbalistic normativity and digestion into Judaism became was try to avoid that, try to avoid reasons to go crazy and die in the fire.
So
In the
what
1800s, yeah.
Oh no, I wanted to pause for a second because you mentioned like more dour based versus like entheogenic based. So like what is an example of like an entheogenic based form of chassidut?
That's a great question. And the main one we have an example of is the Valshamtos movement in the 1800s. I grew up in a neighborhood that was Hasidic, but didn't have Williamsburg, you know. Um, my family wound up there not as part of the community. My dad was sent there as a lawyer for poor people. So we were there, but not within the context of community. I was sent to modern Orthodox school. So I had a lot of flexibility and perspective around the thing going on. And it's very dour. Satmar Williamsburg on the outside is very dour. And I'm sure as much as we encounter a lot of people from the community at festivals and even in sort of festival context within Satmar, you see how much the dour is the outside and the ecstatic core is the inside. And I think that is one of the general principles in Judaism is a sort of different core from an inside. Which is even one of the main mystical narratives about God himself, crying on the inside, laughing on the outside, or vice versa. But it was very unclear why, because a lot of early Chassidus sounds very entheogenic. It's on the official excommunication writs of the Vilna Gaon. You guys are using smoking and drinking to get high and daven. But the external experience of the community nowadays especially is very pragmatic, non-entheogenic triggered people and communities. And the mystery of how one became the other is the challenge of authenticity within that. Because I think there's a will towards mystical revival that looks for precedent to ground itself in. And the challenge of integrating into traditional relationships to the ecstatic and the visionary and the mystical is all of those communities are built on the ashes of the moment that triggered the communities. Like the grandkids of ecstatic communities are very often the most conservative people in the world. We see this in Sufisms. We see this in like, Presbyterians, sort of all the post-Anabaptist sort of Huguenot Quakerisms. Quakers theoretically are ecstatics, but you can't really build long-term continuity and stability just on the ecstatic. On the contrary, that's all built on sensitivity to other people's priorities, to the kids, which are normativity themselves.
So slow down for a second. Like, what
Sure.
is ecstatic? What is ecstatic? Sort of, what is currently ecstatic about Chassidus today? What do you think has gotten lost between like the genesis of the Hasidic movement with the Baal Shem Tov and now? And then the third part of my question is, how do psychedelics and cannabis like rein that in and like rekindle that?
Right. That's a great question. And that is the big question. I don't think it ever went away completely. I think a lot of the Holocausts and pogroms and internal repressions were all devastating in their ways, but I don't think it ever went away. I think that core is still there in the intimate practice, in the thing happening quietly. And from there, it's just different triggers. Like a lot of, let's say in Judaism, part of the quest of Cannabis Chassidus is where did marijuana go in Judaism? Because when I first encountered marijuana, it felt very revelatory in a comfortable, relaxed way. I think some psychedelics feel revelatory in a less comfortable, less relaxed way, and that's the work and challenge in them. But cannabis felt like coming home to my mom's lap, felt like remembering what it was like to be 4 years old, and very refreshing in that way that a lot of the narrative in Psalms, in Hallel, in a lot of Jewish ritual asks to be, like Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew our days like of old. And I think what happened in a nutshell is a lot of stuff was lost as far as what the triggers themselves are. Like even Chris Bennett is on sort of a quest to prove whatever ancient archaic soma and halma in the Vedic and sort of Zoroastrian traditions are. Why is it a mystery? The mystery is because there's a break in continuity having to do with lack of access to particular things. And a lot of what we do in Judaism is replace whatever we don't have with whatever we do. In the absence of a temple, we have a Shabbos table. And that's always been the sort of boat of Theseus sort of tension in Rabbinic Judaism, where you need to have the catharsis, you need to have the things that different sacred events and triggers have in our lives, but you don't necessarily have access to things once the roads are shut down. Because the major crisis that I think all of the Torah and all of Judaism exists in is the empire and the conflict between empires, which is a lot of control over what can get from where. And I think that's all. I mean, there's some controversy in the last while over proving that there is a literal entheogenic tradition within Judaism. And the main argument against it is that it's not part of normative Judaism. And the hints to what was there before the color blue was made illegal, before tchelis and argamon were made illegal, before they had to write down the sounds of the shofars because they were worried they were going to forget, before the transition away from prophecy into pilpul and into dialectic, is always a little bit of a sort of see how we can re-nourish the seeds kind of thing. And it is compared to the difference between like seeds and rocks. In the mystical tradition, even like the children of Korach are sort of the emblem of it, where the children of Korach are buried under the ground, but they'll come back like seeds. Like that famous meme.
My bat mitzvah parsha.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Right. Which is one of the more redemptive appearances of Ketoret in the Chumash specifically, where they just use it to figure out like who's right. Mm-hmm. There is something that transcends the particular that is part of the frameworks. And I think that is part of the tradition of replacing Torah with like saying the Torah, replacing the ritual for the story of the ritual, in the absence of the things. And as a kid, I really valorized how much Judaism had that, as opposed to all the indigenous traditions that couldn't survive their context, that really needed the sacred groves, and without the yews and the oaks couldn't quite be druids anymore.
So are you
I
saying
really,
that like kind of getting rid of some of these more entheogenic practices actually enabled the Jewish people to survive in, like you mentioned, like sort of the empire context of like all of this other war that was happening like around the Jewish people, like in diaspora? Like what, like when you said it's not normative for psychedelics or cannabis or entheogens to like be part of Jewish practice, like that's today, but what about, you said like in the very original times? Does that make sense, that question?
right. And it does a lot of ways. And I think there's two major stages to describing the change. There's blaming the Romans, couldn't get stuff through, oh well. And then there's the internal thing happening within the community as far as what the emergent power structures and responsibility structures were appreciative of the opportunity to do. And that's one of the big mysteries of early rabbinic Judaism, is how much was the empire used as an excuse to make transition away from the sort of unstable, chaotic nature of prophetic religion, and transition into something based on something like reason, and how much was really just picking up after the devastation and trying to come up with ways of still having, because I think it's less about replacing the entheogens and more about just trying to be okay until you have the temple.
So just going back to the basics, can you like explain sort of what version, like what instances of entheogenic ritual and use have occurred and been central to Jewish practice over the years, whether in the time of the Baal Shem Tov or in more ancient biblical times? Like which instances stand out for you?
Right. It's a great question, because there is a lot of extrapolation back and forth, and that has always been the habit and even practice, I'd say, of Pharisaical Judaism and Chassidis, to reread the past in the context of the present and assume that the thing that you're describing is the thing that it was, so that you have access to the meaning in it immediately. Instead of reading about how things used to be, it's like, no, we are leaving Egypt right now. We're carrying the bread that we carried on our backs right now. I'll say the main platforms for ongoing entheogenic juice in Judaism are Saturday night, our Purim, our Simchas Torah. I think you have Kiddush as the main place for something like the entheogenic experience, except Kiddush is very public and very alcohol driven, like to the degree that we're speculating about what else was in the wine and can be in the wine and is in the wine whenever everyone just throws it into the wine or into the grape juice punch bowl or whatever. There's a difference between the institutionalized sharing, which is where everyone is exposed to everyone and where practices and how to handle them are introduced, and the wider open frameworks where there's more space for discovery, which I think of as more the Havdalah practice. Because really, the place we see cannabis use amongst modern Hasidim is Havdalah. I mean, that's the main place that there's recirculation, Lag BaOmer, weddings, because Shabbos is prohibitive to need for things.
The
way Shabbos was set was not to maximize.
You said it's prohibitive on Shabbos to need for things, but I think there is also a tradition of people, if they're not smoking specifically, that they can also just take an edible, and it's not a need, but it's an enhancement for Shabbos.
Right. But there's tension even around that, even around like consumption before a certain point, eating before davening. The thing that replaces the entheogens is really the prayers, is really the order of the prayers. And Terence McKenna talks about this a little bit, how there's a lot of practices that are themselves entheogenic and like psychoactive. And a lot of those are really about trying to bring back the thing that we used to need the substances for, the memory and the effect. And this is very liberating. This is very powerful. In a lot of ways, this is the beginning of religion. This is arguably the main thing happening in the Vedas, where you are the temple. Your stomach is the temple. Your spirit and your intention is the temple. And from there's an occasional return to the triggers. Like once a year, Purim is a very big deal. You know, and another part of the year, Simchas Torah, is a different kind of big deal. Purim, I think, is closer to the sort of archaic, complete going in, and even the language around it is chayav inish libesume, to spice, which is then associated with alcohol because it's the best thing we had, you know.
And what about Simchas Torah?
Once I was locked up in prison for Purim. Simchas Torah is much later, is the thing about Simchas Torah, but it has to do with the lack specifically, because Simchas Torah only developed in the absence of the temple. Like Purim existed.
Go on. So you said you were talking about a story when you were locked up for Purim.
Right. You can't have alcohol in prison. They have rules. So what are you going to do? So people would get creative and just do strange, terrible things with whatever chemicals you were allowed to have, you know, roach spray on sage or whatever. Or you could just try to get into ideas that would trigger the effect. But in the absence of the ideas, and even in the presence of the ideas, but the absence of the impact from the ideas being in the degree that you want them to be, is the return to where the triggers are. And I really appreciate so much the global entheogenic tradition for that reason. This will come up with the India question also in another one of the dialogues. There's a Rav Zalman / Shlomo Torah about what we need the outside world for constantly, which is to refresh the purity of heart that we don't have, because trauma is so intense, and trauma is very communal. Trauma is generally across the board, parents to children, friends to spouses, you know. And in order to see past that, there needs to be places and traditions that we can be refreshed through. And within the sort of smaller range of what Judaism has had access to, because of its own concern about preserving whatever it has, it can't help but still notice and appreciate the good things that come through. One of the things that I romanticize about cannabis in Judaism is just the lack of prohibition. They never really quite found a reason or way to outlaw the thing itself. You can read Jeremiah as deploring like Ketoret, and you can read the ultimate decision not to make incense a fundamental part of the religion the way other things are, as dismissal. But they did institutionalize the memory of it, you know, the story of it, so that we would recognize what we were looking for in the thing. And that is sort of the conclusion of the book Cannabis Chassidis. As much as the triggers, as much as the entheogens,
it's institutionalized.
The core impact and the core transformation.
So you're saying that the cannabis is institutionalized in the incense specifically, or like where else would it be institutionalized?
Right, that's a good example. I mean, the incense offering is deeply fetishized and institutionalized in a way that is hard to justify and generally unpopular. Like it's all the prayers, Shabbos morning, everyday morning, and even the afternoon prayers in all the post-Zohar traditions, just mention it. A lot of sort of mystical meditation associated with just like the letters and numbers around it in the hopes of giving it meaning, that it wouldn't just be listing things you don't have. You know, can you imagine how sad it is just to list drugs you don't have? Just to go through a big list of just like the great things you don't have access to and be like, you know. I think the practice was to try to give the thing in the thing, because there's a famous Hasidic story about the Rizhner unable to do what the Valshamtos could do, but able to tell the story in the hopes that the story would pass that on. And I think that is the main saving grace of the Hasidic movement into normative Judaism, is that there would be a story for recognition. Because I mean, I think in nowadays, modern Chassidus, there's just a lot of space for people's personal and theogenic exploration. I think you'll have attested how much personal exploration research is happening within the communities, just because we grew up with the stories of mystics who weren't trying to make money, weren't trying to like just hold together structures, where their virtue wasn't defined by how much they had successfully like won a war or something. Their virtue was described by how much they were able to get perspective and bring perspective back.
So are you
And
saying
this was always described, especially in early Chassidus. Hmm?
Are you saying that because there's a tradition of ecstatic states in Chassidus that motivates or like provides a platform for people today to then seek out those ecstatic states through entheogenic use?
Without having to if they don't want to. Because that's sort of the pickle. Like, I think there was a moment in the Hasidic movement and a moment in like psychedelic culture that sort of insists, like Purim, that everyone should see this. It's arguably one of the main sort of conflicts between Timothy Leary's model and like, what's his name? Aldous Huxley, right? Do you need to have the experience yourself, or should we just make sure that like the Rebbe has the experience and then he can give it over? Similar tension on Mount Sinai, right? Everyone is having the experience of the splitting of the sea, but people are a little overwhelmed. They don't all want to die on Mount Sinai. Can you just go up there and give us something stable that we can build from? And the Hasidic movement in general moved towards like the second, have that guy be the Rebbe, have that guy be the mystic. And we'll just hang out here drinking soup. When he comes back, we'll like listen to him and be healed by his presence. And the luxury in this model is that you don't have to go crazier than you want to go. You know, the Hasidic movement was actually mostly motivated by Jews trying to hustle and live and just trying to feel okay about their mostly sort of business-based lives. Baruch Hashem, you know, bourgeoisie-based existence that builds enough stability that you can have food at the Shabbos table and then tell stories about this crazy thing that happened to a buddy, you know, and the thing he learned in the chamber. I think that is the lasting and continuous legacy of the Hasidic movement that really did threaten to burn itself out at the very beginning, like the Sabbatean movement, like even the Amoraic movement and the Tanaim and Rabbi Akiva, where the whole thing did actually burn itself out pretty fast because it was made of a personal ecstatic contention with the other thing going on, which either predated on it or just sort of needed different from within it, you know?
So
like even the Rabbi Akiva narrative is a little ambivalent. Yeah, sorry.
I had it. No, I had a few
The Rabbi
questions
Akiva narrative is a little ambivalent about whose fault the whole thing is.
with the Rabbi Akiva narrative.
Yeah, sorry.
No, all good. I like hearing you riff. There were two questions that I had. One of them was, I just want to backtrack. We mentioned Purim, which is like sort of an obvious holiday for entheogenic states. Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah is like, maybe Shmini Atzeret too, but Simchas Torah also is like obvious, but less prototypical, I would say. So like, what is the example of using an entheogenic psychedelic experience on Simchas Torah? Then I'll get to my other question too.
Right. And I'll acknowledge how different Simchas Torah is even since the Roman times. Didn't exist until the temple was destroyed and is really sort of an echo of the temple holiday, which already was divisive. The narrative in the Bible is already the temple holiday itself is a bit divisive because it's also out of control and super joyous. Like these examples, like there was never happiness like there was at the Simcha Beit HaShoeva in the 7th month holiday in the temple. But the temple is destroyed. Sukkot is not like that. Sukkot is actually much more sitting in a sukkah, and there is space for just sitting and contemplating and doing and eating and consuming and being consumed in a sort of very safe, very pro-visionary sort of framework. But then at the end of it is really the alcohol holiday, which is not about contemplation, which is not about ideas. It's about like holding a heavy, heavy Torah and dancing and kissing it, feeling the velvet against your face while you just get really drunk. And I've heard argued it's because of the lack of the thing. Simchas Torah is the holiday of we can't really have the thing we're supposed to have. Let's just work with what we've got and stop thinking about it and stop talking about it and just celebrate it. It's much more of an ego embrace holiday in that way. All the songs aren't about just, you know, God's light. They're about us and the thing we do and how great the thing we do is, you know. And I've heard it compared to Native Americans after losing the war. Anyone who took their whole lives and the way they were doing things seriously enough to not be okay with losing it died in the war because you had to, because you just fought until the end. And the only survivors were the ones who could make the whole thing cultural, could just become alcoholics, resign themselves to just, okay, I guess that's what you're serving, and turn the entire life practice into something that more you could just have in a room and sing songs about. And that's tragic, but also that's how you survive. And the blessing in that is that whatever else in the tradition that needs to live can, at least through the stories, at least through the preservative aspect of alcohol.
So I guess my question is like, there are opportunities where within Jewish practice, like Shabbos or Purim or Simchas Torah or whatever, where like would be obvious opportunities to incorporate like a psychedelic experience. But I also, one of the questions when we went over this before in our notes, I said, how is the framework of the Jewish religion itself psychedelic, with or without the substances? As a means of helping us grapple with our own humanity and the perspective of there being more out there in the universe. So sort of just like how, like that was a whole question, which I guess I'll rephrase as like, how is Judaism itself a psychedelic practice? Like what about the religion mind altering?
Right, that's a great question. It's built around fundamental cycle patterns, around the mystery of the 3, the 7, and the 12. The earlier mystical literature makes that very clear, that everything is wrapped around 7s, 3s, and 12s. And I think even in like the books of Enoch, there's like an idea of the ascent of 7 heavens, going back to like the Babylonian thing, where there's also like 7 gates of the thing. I think that is a lot of the framework theater of it, just how much there is built around noticing the 7 patterns. Shabbos is Shabbos, but Shabbos is also the 7th month holiday when all that thing happens. And on top of the 7, there's 8. There's a long tradition of building on the frameworks and the conceptual limitations on the frameworks and the idea of the thing afterwards. 7 sevens becomes the 50th gate. It's almost hard to talk about without just sort of going into the local esoteric slang. And that's a little bit of testament to the visionary nature of the whole thing. I think a lot of Kabbalah and Chassidut evolved in trying to just make a lot of that more coherent and accessible. Because I can talk about the nature of 7s in an abstract way, but unless each of those steps along the way is somehow personified, it's a little incoherent and hard to relate to, except in a visionary way. And so much of the initiatory tradition within Judaism, in Kabbalah, is about giving meaning to those stages along the way. I would argue the 7 is bigger, but so is sort of decrying the 7. There's a funny ambivalence in Judaism that I think reminds me of sort of Sufi and Zen impulses to describe a framework while sort of disparaging the impulse to deify the framework. The 7 are very big, but don't confuse the 7 with like God. Right. God is this whole other all-inclusive, non-inclusive thing. And I think that idea in Judaism, which is a development, an abstract idea of God is somehow distinct from the 7 stars and somehow inclusive of them, and a system that tidally relates the 3 unfolding into the 7, into the 12. On the one hand, it's one of the main ways we still have any of Babylonian and Hellenistic mystery religion applied in an extended way. And there's a push and pull in it, sort of like a jellyfish, where there's the super concise version of Judaism, which still does the things. You still have a Passover Seder. If you're completely secular and don't do anything else, you still have a Passover Seder, still like Hanukkah candles. And those are still very deep contemplative experiences if you make any time or space for just like listening and hearkening to the voice in them. And on the other hand, there's a lot of esoteric arcana. When I first came to Israel, a lot of the beginning of getting into Chassidis for me, not just being around Hasidic community, but getting into the content and the theology and the practice in an immersive way that wasn't about like just understanding, but was about somehow changing and being changed through. There is just so much extra stuff you can always do. There's just extra layers of intentions built on all of the words and all of the rituals and all of the preparation before the ritual and all the preparation afterwards. And all of it is very gently brushed away with a hand every time it just gets too complicated to be accessible. And this is understood deeply in all of the Mishnaic tradition and all of the Torah, that there's 2 yuds in God's name. When you just kind of write it as 2 yuds, one of them is like everything you can do and all the details, and one of them is just the essence of the whole thing, which is really, none of the things. and just remembering the presence and the breath inherent in all the things. And it's really important to have both of those things, I think, as part of branching out and getting perspective and not losing the self to perspective. And I think that is the fundamental framework thing that Judaism has to offer psychedelia, is a way to go out and a way to come back. Baki baratz, baki b'shov, like the angels ascending and descending.
So what's like a practical example of that, of like a way to go out and a way to come back? So like a way to like ascend and have a high psychedelic experience, then a way to ground and come back down in a safe kind of like integrative way.
I mean, one of the core things is the letters themselves, is around each of the months, around each of the weeks, around each of the letters, there's a very simple phonetic meditation that is a little bit adherent to the language, adherent to the letter Aleph and adherent to the letter Bet, and all the more so able to be played around. Each of the months gets a different attribute. There's different versions of what things are, but all of those are available to step into and step out of. But I think even the faith encounter itself, even stepping out of being about to eat something and just making a blessing, is the beginning of intentionality, is the beginning of being able to make a commitment to come back. I think that is part of what the practice has always been, is a way back from the ego dissolution. And this is a big part of the narrative around Mount Sinai and all of the sort of temple stuff after Mount Sinai, the danger of dissolving and losing any kind of ego integrity, which is a wonderful danger if you have too much ego integrity. You know, it's what a relief, you know, finally get to spend the time with the God beyond myself. And on the other hand, a lot of the common denominator between the ancient religions that is resolved in Yom Kippur is the tension between the God beyond yourself that he'd really rather you be curious about and see beyond, and the God that wants you to have a self, you know, the self that wants to exist, and the thing beyond the self that still would rather just be a small self. They say that is why they released the Go to Azazel in the Yom Kippur ritual, which was basically about not resenting the world. Like, there's two goats, and one of them is sacrificed like every other sacrifice, like everything else we give up, you know, our time, our money, whatever, everything else we give up. And one of them is not. One of them is released alive, not to God, but to Azazel. And the tradition is that Azazel is a metaphor for God's priority that actually preferred that there just be ego personal existence. And this is one of the huge tensions, I think, in Judaism, how much space it makes for ego personal priorities as sacred. I want to have a family, so I'll have a family. So Abraham's desire to like have kids isn't just sort of attachment and materialism. It is, and who cares? You know, it is, it isn't, it's still somehow bound up in the thing that's allowed to be identified with the divine, while still demanding that it be seen past. I think this is one of the challenges that it deeply grounds in Judaism, somehow recognizing the ego priorities and sanctifying around them. Kiddush is made of whatever you like most, bread, wine, whatever you need. And on the other hand, not feeling trapped in that. Mm-hmm. And I think all the rituals, and Kiddush is an example, but Kiddush gives way to Yom Kippur, where even the thing in Kiddush is relieved.
So that was kind of my next question, when you said like there is sort of this choice, you know, you can make Kiddush on whatever you want, really. So one of the things that we talked about before is with regard to like specific entheogens like acid, cannabis, mushrooms, rue, opiates, etc., which lend themselves best to a psychedelic practice. And can you draw from personal experience in describing your own Jewish psychedelic practices?
Sure. And the Kiddush metaphor, I think, works because Kiddush in general is made of normativity. Kiddush is familial, the kids can sing along, but Simchas Torah is made of the same thing applied into full insanity and abuse, as a way of getting beyond the limitations through the things we love, but even of the things we love. Because it's actually very hard to keep drinking on Simchas Torah. You're too busy dancing, you know? I was always fascinated by how much liturgy there is theoretically in Simchas Torah around the Hakafos. There's like 7 sort of going arounds, and theoretically there's like things you could be saying for them, but I've never seen a community where they bother. They do the introductory little song one at the beginning, and then just every song they want to do. Cannabis is much more stable. I think our experience, Terrence McKenna refers to it as our daily bread, you know, and much of our experience, even of community, even of elders, they don't really stop smoking weed so much. People who appreciate weed once they're no longer even past like age 20, who don't get over it by like 22. It's a lifetime sort of avoda and a sort of like easy thing to want to come back to because its nature is more comforting than challenging, but make space for the challenging too, as opposed to stronger things like acid, which are demanding. My experience of elders is that they have less interest for acid unless they're hardcore, unless they really want to keep challenging themselves, unless they really, really want to be a little overwhelmed, which I think a lot of people don't. I think a lot of stability is built over not challenging ourselves, not overwhelming ourselves, as if life isn't overwhelming enough already, as if like trying to raise a family and stuff isn't overwhelming, and yet so important and so appreciated. There is an example given in one of the rituals popular in Judaism that's not actually very popular in Judaism is sanctifying the moon. Once a month, before the moon gets full, sanctifying the moon. And part of the liturgy in it mentions that, if I could only see the face of my Father in heaven once a month, that would be enough. And I think there are some things where it's not like that. You need to see God all the time. How could you feel good unless you're seeing God all the time? How could you be any kind of spiritual or religious unless like God is in the room all the time? But on the other hand, if God is in the room all the time, there's not a lot of space for me to do my things and take care of my responsibilities. I suffer terribly from dysfunctionality. I think a lot of my friends might also, from just not being able to get their shit together because we're just a little too intoxicated with just, it's okay, divine clarity, just breath. Why do anything if I can just take a deep breath and appreciate what I am and appreciate how much God is alive in every breath? Except, the room is getting grosser and grosser and those dishes aren't getting washed and like the bills are coming and what are you going to do? Furtively forget God completely eventually because I just need to just get the shit together and it's an emergency. It's a pekuach nefesh, it's a sort of...
I feel like when you neglect your surroundings or even if you neglect your body, then you're like neglecting the dwelling place of Hashem.
Right, which is part of the goal of drugs, I'd say. Like the word for drugs in Aramaic, let's say even soma, I think is one of the more universal words. Like you have the Vedic word and the Hebrew word samim are very similar. And the word in Hebrew in Aramaic implies blindness. Like a summa is someone whose eyes are covered. And it occurred to me once very early on, that's because the nature of drugs, I'm going to use that word widely to include like opiates and things that we may not consider entheogenic, but really are made of intentional consumption of something mixed by people in order to blind from one thing so I can notice another thing. And I think this is a lot of the work of focus in the world and the challenge of focus in the world, losing track of the surroundings in order to focus on the mission. And this could be part of the problem with abstract thought, with words at all. This is part of the crisis in verbal phonetic religion, swings towards the patristic because it swings towards the left brain, abstract, and thus, Leonard Schlein, I think one of the great elaborators of the problem of the patriarchy, but also justifies the degree to which it was just great for just like getting focused, invade a country because you just have a rule that we are invading the country because we are the invaders.
Yeah, no, go. I don't want to finish your thought, and then I have.
That's a good one. That's a terrible thought to do. That's like the problem with urgency and with having a focus is that sensitivity to impact is nullified.
Mm-hmm.
That is the problem with all the Freudian slip there, patristic patriotisms. And with word religion, with imperative religion, where there's just like a name and a word, and that's what I'm doing, and I can't be sensitive. And I think one of the great reliefs of Chassidis and psychedelia is to be able to overcome our sense of what we're supposed to be doing once in a while. And I think that is part of the even ritualized stepping away from assumptions, stepping away from rules in something like Purim, in something like Torah, use the rules to overcome the rules so that we could actually be sensitive a little bit and let the goddess back for a second, just to notice what everything's for, just to smell the air and appreciate Shabbos.
So what is like for you if you were to integrate a psychedelic, like say acid, into a Jewish practice? Like, what does it look like for you? Like, either give me an anecdote or a general practice you have.
Yeah, well, this is a great question, because I think the challenge is how much of a structure is too much of a structure. I have found for myself, my use of acid has always been more personal than guiding other people. And I think I've had much more trouble when there's even been a thought to guide someone else's experience, because that's when you're part of the problem. You know, that's when your voice is in contradiction with whatever someone's experiencing. And that's not what these things are for, you know. Tim Leary once wrote that great book with Rav Zalman, actually, Psychedelic Prayers, where they translated the Tao Te Ching into advice. And the first thing is the best of guides, you don't know they're a guide. You don't even notice they're there. You think it's your own voice. You know, you hear your own voice finally, and because you were guided by someone who was enough out of the way. And I think framework around psychedelia for me, and I think in general, is best with a certain amount of spacious minimalism for noticing the impact. So festival moments that are active but not demanding. Simchas Torah is a great example, because there's a thing going on. It's going on whether you're doing it anyway. You're participating in it, but it doesn't demand your attention and fealty. I felt very challenged. And this is part of Rav Zalman's testimony also, by relating to liturgy in a fixed way. He described the first time he took acid in opening a siddur and just being surprised at how much the words didn't sing to him. And he realized it was because he didn't quite have a relationship to them. But I read that before I ever took acid. So I sort of knew that the relationship to the liturgy had to come before. And for me, a lot of the work is that the sense of meaning should be in the songs before I start singing them, rather than, but I shouldn't say rather than, because the discovery is also there amidst, the discovery is also there in the time and space with the encounter. So I think nature is very important. But there's two different sides, I think, to psychedelia. There's going out and having an experience that changes you. And then there's integration of the experience into ritual setting, something more like the Jimi Hendrix model or the Cohen Gadol model, where because you are in a zone, you're able to share the zone with people who cannot go there with you, you know? And I've experienced that in sort of davening frameworks, where the thing that's being experienced is able to happen in a public way because it's been gone over in a private way, because the words and the triggers and the associations have already been so injected with meaning that it becomes more of a jazz thing, where the familiar suddenly starts to have notes of subtle realization, subtle implication within them. And I think that's a lot of where it's at. I think space for the personal experience is pretty important. And then space for being able to sing the personal experience back into the collective experience is just wonderful and relieves the alienation of discovery. Because a lot of the thing I love most about Torah and Judaism is a language for describing our priorities and relating. It's what I love about politics also. You know, politics is mostly about our priorities and how we relate to them, finding a language around them. And part of what I love so much about Judaism that I think keeps me coming back is how precious it is to have any kind of language to describe what's real for us in these places, and traditions of other people who spent time on these mountains and came back with all kinds of conclusions. I hate to keep harping on Rabbi Akiva, but a lot of the development of the Kabbalistic tradition is associated with him just caring enough to bring things back. Because there's a story that there's 4 guys who go into paradise, and 3 of them don't really come back with useful information so much. You know, one of them just has a personal, like, philosophical confusion between above and below, and he's still there, you know, he's still there trying to measure the space between above and below, and no one else really has anything to learn from him because he's just, you know, very obsessed with this sort of little subtle thing that's really more about his perspective. This is Howard Schwartz's fort on the 4 that go into paradise. One of them just straight up goes, just dies. You know, he just really wanted to see God, and he did, and that's that for him. And they attribute to him the line, how lucky are those who taste the honey that I've hidden away for them, you know. They learn enough from him. If you, and this is one of my favorite pieces of advice, health and like psychedelia, if you get some honey, taste it. Don't swallow it. Taste as little as you can so that you can not be overwhelmed. Because if you take too much, you're just going to wind up throwing it up. And one guy is just very troubled by everything wrong with the world. And he finds a dispensation to just stop, to just change everything he's doing and switch sides. Lisha bin Abuya, he's very offended over how God made the world. And he eventually goes all the way up on his journey of paradise to see that it's not God who's writing those rules. It's just Metatron. It's another dude who once climbed the ladder and he's still there just writing rules. And that relieved him of the yoke of having to be Jewish and having to do any of the things or care about any of the priorities that had been on the big list. And he stayed a teacher to one of the major guys writing the Mishnah, but there's not a lot quoted in him, because the main things quoted by him are like, why are you wasting your time here? Why are you wasting your time here? He would go to the Batei Midrash and just say, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be a great artist. Why are you wasting your time having these dumb conversations when you could be doing something productive? And that was the 80s in a lot of ways. That was the voice of the entire 80s. It's like, why are you wasting your time when you could be just doing stuff or breaking things? I don't know. And then, but Rabbi Akiva, the saving grace that let him ascend in peace and descend in peace, not that he ended so well, was just that he cared about content that he wanted to bring back. And they attribute the entire mystical tradition to those journeys, the entire Sefer Yetzirah, to things that he cared enough about his friends and family and just people to want to draw down. And I feel very inspired by that. I feel like that is the thing that keeps me also from just sort of whiffling off into self-delusion and my own little personal Hawaii's far away, and just wanting to ground back into extended lineage of dialogue, just so the kids should be able to have fun and have just like basic advice in the back of their heads at their parties,
So, to circle it back around just to the original beginning of our conversation with Cannabis Chassidis, like what, for you also, like what is your cannabis, like to you, like what is your cannabis Jewish practice now? Like how, like in what way does like to consume cannabis feel like a Jewish experience? And like, do you integrate it specifically into certain frameworks that are part of the religion?
That's a really great question. I do and don't, because part of the nature of cannabis is to evaporate identity. And part of, I think, the danger in sacramentalization is making the ritual the whole thing. And the truth is, I just literally, sometimes I realize at one point, I just only have so much time. I used to spend hours in prayer every day, and that felt very important. It felt like a worthwhile thing to make time for, to spend hours getting high and just davening with my whole heart. And there was a time when there was nothing else more useful to do in the world. But then eventually, and I think this is part of the general popular practice, I used to wonder, why do they pray so fast and spend so little time praying? I thought it was about praying in God. And the answer is, there's so much we can do for each other if we just spend less time trying to get ready. So I think a lot of my cannabis practice in Judaism is very much on the level of intentionality. Make a l'chaim, set an intention, notice time of day, have in mind. And from there, a lot of it is minimalization of the intentions into as few words as possible, which you have in Sufism also. A teacher friend in Jerusalem, Yaqub ibn Yosef, who helped me publish my book, and he liked to give over this. He got into Sufism as a personal way of essentializing what God and spirituality are about. And he really liked how much they just, instead of having a long liturgy, sometimes just say like, like in the Shiva thing, or boom, or just like, just l'chaim. A lot of my deepest incorporation of Judaism into my cannabis use and cannabis, my Judaism use, is l'chaim. It's so good to see you. L'chaim, take the edge off, breathe into appreciation, Yud K in the inhale, Vav Hey in the exhale, and coughing with us all together. A lot of my exploration of Chassidus really was met with the need to not disappear into mythology. A lot of the teachers who cared the most about Chassidus and about Judaism, in my experience, really wanted me to know how important it was just not to lose the real for the stories, because that's how you get fundamentalisms. The stories supersede the real, and then the drugs are for the sake of avoiding the real. And I think that is how you have religious fundamentalism, even psychedelically inspired religious fundamentalism, as opposed to liberation. And I appreciate fundamentalism because at least you're taking things seriously. At least you're taking something that we're doing seriously, and that's always inspiring. But it's good not to lose track of why we're doing things, which is, love and light. And I try not to let my cannabis use try to justify itself in ritual ways more than just the thing itself and the sacred nature of the thing itself being a way of noticing the other thing. And I think I try to relate to my religion that way also. I think I relate to my Kiddush that way. If I used to make a very long Kiddush and people had to wait for it, and like, shh, come on, I'm trying to do a thing. And that's not the highest. The highest is just like pick up something and like, yeah, Al Kain Berach, and then it's still holy and everyone can have fun instead of.
I think I've been party through long Kiddushes.
Right. They're not always so bad. Sometimes I just need a man. Sometimes I just need a long Kiddush. I just need to like sing this extra song. My practice is to put all that in Shalosh Chassidis, have that be the self-absorbed factory of just, I want to sing all the songs and just I'm going to sit here for hours and hours. And it's nice to make time and space for things, I think that is also part of the cannabis practice for me within Judaism is not all the time, not every second is Shabbos, after meals, not before meals. That's a Mishnaic thing. The mukmar comes at the end of meals, and I appreciated hearing there's a tradition of spices and wine at the end of a meal because digestion's pretty crucial, like even within davening, Torah is at the end of Shach, of Musaf, not at the beginning, but it's also at the beginning because sometimes you gotta need something to get you there, need something to get you back.
So one more question, and this is like a quick one, is just in like your elevator pitch, like 1 or 2 sentences, like what is like Jewish psychedelia to you?
It's mostly stories, right? It's mostly letters and words and stories. It's back and forth, like the angels running and returning. That does seem like the common denominator between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, and Rabbi Akiva, the Baal Shem Tov, and all our friends. Is it's nice to get a little space sometimes, and it's nice to come home.
Mm-hmm.